Well, it's such an honor to be here. I really appreciate this opportunity. I prepared some slides, so I'll go right into my presentation to save time. Apparently, there's a lot of development regarding China's nuclear program. Based on publicly available information, it's quite obvious that China is expanding its nuclear arsenal. There's a lot of discussion about China's new ICBM silo sites located in northwestern part of the country. Together, they may host at least 300 ICBM silos. And if you look at the history of Chinese nuclear arsenal, for many decades, China was believed to have about 200 nuclear weapons in total, and now suddenly China is building 300 ICBM silos. And if you think China is going to deploy MIRVed ICBMs into those silos, and according to the most recent DoD report on Chinese military capabilities, the DF-41 ICBM could be armed with about 3 nuclear warheads on each missile. So that can easily add 900 nuclear warheads to China's traditionally small nuclear arsenal, even though we don't know if China is planning to deploy missile in each and every silo built. But the silo-based ICBM is just part of the picture because China is actually implementing a very comprehensive nuclear modernization program. It is, in addition to ICBM silos, it is also expanding its road mobile ICBM forces. It is expanding its sea-based nuclear capabilities, and it's also adding an air leg into its nuclear triad capability. By the way, traditionally, China was very critical of the term nuclear triad. It used to criticize the U.S. and Soviet Union / Russia for developing and maintaining nuclear triad capability as a symbol of nuclear hegemonism. But now China itself is openly talking about its own nuclear triad capability. Last year, the U.S. defense and intel community assessed that by 2027, China might develop up to 700 nuclear warheads, and by the end of this decade, 2030, China may have at least 1,000 nuclear weapons. So if you look at the change in numbers, that's a very significant change. And there is also a very important change in the official narratives. For many years, the Chinese official narrative, when talking about nuclear capabilities, is that China maintains a lean and effective nuclear force. But in 2021, during the 2 sessions, the most important political conferences in China, the official talking point became that China will accelerate the construction of high-level strategic deterrent system. And in this year, 2020, during the recently concluded 20th Party Congress, the official narrative becomes that China will develop a powerful strategic deterrent capability system. I think the change in narratives is also very obvious. So why China is changing its nuclear capability? The most widely discussed reasons are that China has been worried about American technical capabilities in both the nuclear field but also non-nuclear field. The U.S. has been improving a wide range of non-nuclear strategic capabilities that could, in one way or another, undermine the overall survivability and credibility of Chinese second strike capability, and that includes missile defense, conventional precision strike weapons, space-based sensors that can more accurately and timely detect, track, and trail Chinese nuclear weapon platforms in the ocean or on the land. Even cyber technologies could be used to potentially undermine Chinese capability to launch its nuclear weapons in a retaliation. And among all these technologies, missile defense is obviously the most concerning to China. And China uses worst-case scenario thinking when evaluating the impact of missile defense, because China always assumes that the U.S. will launch a comprehensive disarming strike first, using perhaps not only nuclear but also conventional strike capabilities to destroy as many Chinese nuclear weapons as possible, and therefore only a small number of Chinese nuclear weapons would survive a preemptive first strike, and therefore even a limited scale U.S. homeland missile defense could potentially intercept the survived Chinese nuclear weapons, and therefore undermining the overall credibility. And of course, China is also worried about the recent trend in the United States about using theater-range missile defense systems like Standard Missile 3 to work as under a layer of the homeland missile defense system. There was a dispute in 2016 about the U.S. deployment of the THAAD missile defense system, even though that's a theater-range system, even less capable than the SM-3 system. There was a huge debate about the real capacity of the radar, the ANTPY-2 radar of the THAAD system, whether that could distinguish Chinese warheads from decoys and therefore significantly improve the efficiency of U.S. homeland missile defense. So all of these concerns are very real. And then after the demise of the INF Treaty in 2019, there is growing Chinese concern about U.S. deployments or forward deployment of precision conventional missiles in places near China that could potentially threaten Chinese nuclear systems. So facing all these new technological developments, and many of the technologies are invisible. How do the two countries agree on the degree of the impact of all these new technologies on the survivability of Chinese nuclear weapons, and therefore be able to maintain a basic nuclear balance between the two sides? That's a real challenge. And of course, there is also the impact from third-party players like North Korea, because the two countries, North Korea and China, are so closely located. North Korean ICBMs that target the American homeland would fly a very similar trajectory as Chinese, many of Chinese ICBMs that target American homeland. And therefore, American homeland missile defense system that can intercept North Korean ICBMs would have some capability to affect Chinese ICBMs. So how do we potentially address this entanglement of Chinese and DPRK capabilities and so that American missile defense could only affect North Korea without affecting China? That's also a challenge presented by technology and geography. So these are all technical level drivers, which I think are real. A couple of years ago, I wrote a report to discuss the real Chinese concern about U.S. missile defense and how that affects Chinese nuclear thinking. However, I don't think these technical level explanations fully explain the current round of Chinese nuclear buildup. Because firstly, there is no, if you think that China is mostly worried about U.S. missile defense and increasing American nuclear preemptive strike capabilities, and therefore China needs to build up. But on the American side, there is no abrupt and substantial improvement of either nuclear or missile defense capability. The U.S. has been incrementally improving those capabilities, but there's nothing abrupt and nothing substantial. But so that cannot explain the rather abrupt and rather massive increase of Chinese nuclear arsenal. And secondly, if I do believe among all the technical level factors, American homeland missile defense is the greatest Chinese concern. But then if you look at the silos, right, which is the most important part of Chinese current nuclear buildup, silo-based ICBMs are not really ideal for addressing missile defense concern. It's not the most cost-effective manner to address missile defense concern. So that doesn't help explain the buildup. And thirdly, if you read Chinese writings by Chinese civilian and military experts, they don't appear be aware of the Chinese buildup until the silo sites were reviewed by international analysts using commercially available satellite image. And even senior military experts, who is perhaps the most one of the most prominent Chinese military experts on nuclear issues, on strategic security issues. And this expert wrote and published a book on China's nuclear policy, on U.S. China nuclear relationship, very recently. And because the draft of the book was written before the revelation of Chinese silo sites, and in the book, the expert never mentioned a need for China to massively build up its nuclear force. Actually, the expert recommended very explicitly in the book that China should continue its incremental approach of nuclear modernization. So it looks like even the experts themselves were not aware of the buildup in a large part. And after the revelation of the buildup, many of them still do not appear to understand what's the real military rationale that would be, that would justify this buildup. And lastly, when Chinese officials were posed the question about why China is building up, they didn't really talk about American missile defense threats or new American nuclear capabilities. They were talking about the need to increase the safety and security of their nuclear arsenal. If the buildup is really driven by growing concern about U.S. missile defense, I think Chinese officials would have every reason, every incentive to openly criticize and point it out the American missile defense program as the reason that China needs to respond to. So I tend to believe that it is actually political level drivers that are primarily behind the recent nuclear buildup. We tend to focus, for a long time, we tend to focus on the military rationale behind China's nuclear program. We talk about the Chinese need to maintain a credible second strike capability, etc., which is true. But from day one of Chinese nuclear program, the political value of nuclear weapons has always been very important. Mao Zedong said very early on that imperialist countries would look down upon us because we don't have atomic bombs and only have grenades, and therefore China should have atomic bombs and develop hydrogen bombs as soon as possible. And Deng Xiaoping, who said if China had not had atomic and hydrogen bombs and launched satellites since the 1960s, it would not have been able to be called a major power with significant influence and would not have had the international status as it has now. And Deng also pointed out if China was to have a higher status and more say in the future world order, it must be backed by a strong nuclear power. Jiang Zemin said that China needs to strive to build a lean and effective strategic nuclear force commensurate with China's great power status, and Hu Jintao said something very similar. China needs to build a strategic missile force commensurate with China's great power status. And Xi Jinping, in particular, in 2012 said, nuclear weapons' fundamental nature as a political weapon won't change. Nuclear forces' strategic role in political, diplomatic, and military struggles won't change. The deterrent effect of nuclear weapons is absolute and cannot be replaced by other armed capabilities, and therefore we must fully understand the strategic cornerstone role of nuclear forces. I think here, Xi Jinping's thinking about nuclear weapons is actually a continuation of previous Chinese paramount leaders in the sense that he wants to build a nuclear force that is commensurate with China's major power status. However, what is different today is what does China's major power status mean today appears to be very different from before. And I think the current political leaders in China, especially the paramount leader, Mr. Xi, he has an interesting, they have an interesting interpretation about today's geopolitical landscape. They certainly are aware that there are growing geopolitical tensions between China and the US-led Western countries, but they attribute all these growing troubles to the structural change in the international balance of power. They attribute all the problems to the power transition process between China and the US-led Western countries. They think that for a long time, the power gap between China and US-led Western countries was still large, and therefore the Western countries, they were comfortable with China's gradual development. But when China is able to narrow that power gap, and when China becomes closer and closer to achieve that power transition, that's when the Western countries would become much more worried and much more desperate to resort to extreme measures in order to slow down China's growth, to contain China, to make sure that China wouldn't be able to continue this path of challenging the Western countries' predominance in the international system. They think the reason the Western countries are increasingly criticizing China on issues of human rights, domestic suppression, Uyghurs, re-education campaign in China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, it's not because the Western countries really care about these issues or human rights or political freedom in China. It's because the Western countries, in order to advance their selfish geopolitical interests, they use these issues as excuses, right, to make trouble for China, to make China harder to continue its rise. So that's their understanding of what is driving the tensions. And because they, in addition to that, a secondary, popular thinking in China is the Western countries' strategic culture is different from China's harmonious culture. The Western culture is by nature hegemonic, and that's hard to change. So for these two reasons, but primarily for the reason of the power transition process, they think the only way to resolve the problem is actually to further accelerate the power transition process. By the time China can build and demonstrate a formidable power, especially strategic power, that's when the US-led Western countries would eventually have to acknowledge the new reality of a risen China, and they would have to eventually deal with China with equality and respect. So it is driven primarily by this power-centric mindset that they believe is the structural change in the international system that's causing all these problems, and therefore the solution has to be at the structural level, and therefore to further focus on building power. And they always talk about Russia, right? Having an equal nuclear power with the United States, being treated by Western countries with much more carefulness, with much more prudence, despite Russia causing troubles at various places. And therefore, even he said, Russia would rather tighten its belt and do nothing else in order to hold on to this matter of nuclear capability. So in order to further accelerate the power transition process, Xi is very attaches great importance to comprehensive military buildup and nuclear, which is regarded as a strategic military capability, is a very important part of this picture in order to change Western countries' perception about the power balance. And she gave very interesting and very specific instructions to Chinese military officials about nuclear development. Instructions that were much more specific, at least in openly available domain, much more specific than previous Chinese leaders. Basically, he upgraded the second artillery from a military branch to a full military service. In 2015, he ordered the PLA, the newly established PLA Rocket Force, to expedite the pace of development in 2016. He instructed the PLA Navy officials that our sea-based nuclear capabilities need to massively develop in a village to a naval base in 2018. And he started to talk about the role of strategic balancing as a mission for China's missile forces, which I think is something new. And I think by talking about strategic balancing, he is referring to this overall strategic and political role of nuclear weapons in affecting foreign countries' perception of the balance of power. And I think one reason China focuses so much on silo-based ICBMs early on in this round of buildup is because that's the fastest way that China can really expand and demonstrate a much larger nuclear, a much greater nuclear capability because of China's unique advantage in building large-scale infrastructure at relatively low cost. And actually, Mao, in 1964, when at that time, before China conducted its first nuclear test, Mao was presented with two options. One is to detonate China's first nuclear device early. The second option is to do that later and use the time to better weaponize the device, to better develop delivery system, because once you reveal to the world that you have a nuclear capability, you become vulnerable before you can fully weaponize the program and you can actually develop the missile system that can give you the real capacity to launch a nuclear weapon. So technically speaking, the second option is better for Chinese security. But Mao basically said, no, the role of nuclear weapons is to scare our adversaries, right? It's the political role that is more important. So he chose the early test option because of this. And this story was also told in Dr. Hui Zhang's research, who is a Harvard-based scholar in his new manuscript on Chinese nuclear weapon program history, which I hope will be published soon. And given this top leadership's view about the political importance of nuclear weapons, and given that China has increasingly centralized decision-making system domestically, the people at the operational level, they can very efficiently implement the top leadership's vision to expand China's nuclear capability. But in addition to that, I think we also need to be aware that when the military is presented with the political mandate to expand the nuclear capability, they also need to develop a more specific thinking about what capabilities specifically they want to develop. And here, I think China's military, at the military level, they are increasingly interested in crisis management capability, and this differs from China's traditional nuclear thinking. Traditionally, China is believed to rely on a relatively simple strategy of massive retaliation to deter nuclear attack, which basically means whatever type of nuclear attack China was subject to, China would launch a massive retaliation against the homeland of the enemy. And actually, Professor Fravel and another scholar, Cunningham, wrote a very important international security article which very well explains these traditional Chinese views about nuclear escalation, which is it's very hard to escalate a conventional war beyond the nuclear level. The risk of a conventional war escalating to the nuclear level is very small because powers, they understand the risk of going nuclear. So despite their rhetorics, in reality, they would rarely really escalate beyond the nuclear threshold. So that's why, for a long time, China was not that worried about, real military threat. And it thought that a massive retaliation capability was more than enough to deter nuclear threats of all types. But once a conventional war escalates beyond the nuclear level, the traditional Chinese thinking is it is really hard to control escalation. And it's really hard to manage escalation. It will very likely quickly escalate all the way to an all-out nuclear exchange. And because of this traditional thinking about nuclear escalation, Chinese strategists paid less attention to how to manage nuclear escalation from a low-level nuclear war to a higher-level nuclear war. Attention was mostly focused on how to prevent a conventional war from ever escalating across the nuclear threshold. However, Chinese military strategy, they also recognized very early on in the 1980s that there is a potential vulnerability in Chinese nuclear capability and nuclear posture, which is the massive retaliation capability and posture may be very effective in deterring a large-scale nuclear attack. But if the enemy launches or threatens a limited nuclear attack, China wouldn't be able to respond appropriately. If you threaten massive retaliation, it's just a too risky decision. It's too escalatory. It's not really credible. But because at that time the China-U.S. security relationship was relatively good and China-Soviet relationship was improving, so I think the Chinese didn't feel the pressure to really invest resources to address this already identified vulnerability in their capability and posture. But in recent years, I think the situation has changed, including the increasing realistic threat, risk of a military conflict over Taiwan with the United States. And here, of course, the growing Chinese conventional military capability at the theater level means that China should have even less incentive to threaten limited nuclear first use because of its growing conventional advantage. But the Chinese concern here is the U.S. also understands very well that it's losing its traditional conventional superiority. And therefore, there is a growing risk that the U.S. might lose a theater conventional war with China, and the U.S. may have a growing need to threaten limited nuclear use or to threaten nuclear escalation, basically. So as a result, China may have to think more seriously about how to deter a limited American nuclear threat. So perhaps that's why we have seen China investing into its theater nuclear forces with very accurate missile system developed and deployed, so that China can have the capability to respond in kind or to respond in proportion to limited nuclear threats in order to deter them from being launched in the first place. There was this reported Chinese testing of an orbital hypersonic missile system last year. Of course, it's up to debate about whether China is what specific military goal that type of system might provide. Of course, we don't know if China is going to really aiming at deploying an orbital hypersonic missile system. At least it appears that China wants to have the capability of long range or maybe even intercontinental range hypersonic missile. But what's the purpose of this missile system? One possible application, I think, is that it can very well work as escalation management capability, because once a nuclear war escalates further beyond original level limited nuclear exchange, the next level is limited exchange at the intercontinental range. Right? If the U.S. further launches a small number of ICBMs against China, China may want to be able to launch also a small number of intercontinental range nuclear systems against the U.S. homeland. But because the U.S. has a missile defense system that may not be able to intercept a large-scale Chinese nuclear retaliation, but may have a reasonable chance of intercepting a limited Chinese intercontinental nuclear retaliation. But if China has highly penetrating intercontinental nuclear system like a hypersonic missile, that could give China this opportunity to respond in kind without worrying about the impact of American homeland missile defense. But that's just my speculation about one of the possible military rationales of this capability. If we look at the Chinese military rhetoric, it appears that the line between nuclear deterrence and nuclear warfighting becomes blurrier in recent years. Since the 2019 Chinese military parade, China starts to use three new terms to describe the mission of Chinese nuclear forces, which is strategic balancing, strategic deterrent and control, and strategic decisive victory. Right? That strategic decisive victory, to be used to describe the role of nuclear forces is something new, and it's certainly up to interpretation. And these terms are repeatedly used in following years. So it's clearly it's official terminology now within the rocket force. And generally speaking, when it comes to military development, Mr. Xi has been emphasizing the importance of the actual capability to fight and win wars. Right? He says, only when you can fight can you stop fighting. And he seems to believe that if your deterrence needs to be, if you want to have a credible deterrence, you actually need to demonstrate the capability to actually fight and win. And again, overall, he stresses the importance of preparing for war. That's a major instruction from him in recent years. And perhaps the PLA rocket force, like other military branches, they also want to demonstrate political loyalty to show that they are faithfully implementing Mr. Xi's instruction on war fighting, preparing for war. So they want to more better incorporate the idea of war fighting into their specific area and specific mission. So increasingly they emphasize on the rapid response capability of missile forces. Again, strategic decisive victory is often talked about. They openly describe their DF-26 missile units as nuclear conventional dual-capable missile units that can carry out full domain deterrence and war fighting. So now when they put nuclear and conventional capabilities together and talk about war fighting, it's somewhat different from their previous narrative, which has been careful in separating the mission of conventional missile forces and nuclear missile forces. That they didn't, talk about the role of war fighting when referring to nuclear missile forces. They also emphasize the importance of combat readiness duty, and is even putting a small number of both conventional and nuclear missile forces on combat readiness duty during peacetime. The thing is, if this is driven indeed by this effort to please the top leadership to fulfill his political mandate, to implement his preparing for war instruction by the rocket force. So the question is, do the rocket force officials fully understand the operational implications of increasingly talking about war fighting and decisive victory for their nuclear forces? I think that's a question we don't have answers to. But one implication of that is, I think, at least they are giving more thoughts to developing escalation management capabilities as they envision increasing real risk of military conflict with the United States. And they increasingly worry the United States is, deliberately trying to lower the nuclear threshold by developing low-yield nuclear weapons, etc. So the threat perception about the United States changing nuclear posture may be also driving this Chinese interest in escalation management capability. And the thing is, traditionally for many decades, China, relied on massive retaliation and was only focused on building a secure second strike capability at the intercontinental level for nuclear deterrent. But now, if it's shifting towards managing escalation, that's a very different set of military requirement for its nuclear forces. Especially if both U.S. and China today are pursuing crisis management capabilities. That's much harder. That's a nuclear equation that is much harder to contain. That's a competition that is much harder to manage. So I think that if that's indeed what China is doing, it could put the U.S. China nuclear relationship in a very different paradigm than before. So again, escalation management is increasingly desirable to the Chinese military, but that doesn't explain the full picture of China's current buildup, because again, the most important and most relevant capabilities for managing nuclear escalation is actually at the theater level, right? Because China is mostly worried about the U.S. Limited theater range nuclear threats, especially involving low-yield nuclear weapons. But if you look at China's current buildup, the ICBM silos that's apparently at the intercontinental range level, that doesn't directly contribute to the escalation management capability. So still, despite this military desire for escalation management, I still think overall the buildup is mostly driven by a top-down political mandate to demonstrate stronger strategic military capability. And when the military and the defense industry, they receive this political mandate from top level, and they are showered with resources, they have no incentive to make hard choices. Right? They can afford to develop different types of capabilities as they desire, and especially when Mr. Xi himself has talked about the importance of developing anti-satellite capabilities, missile defense capabilities, especially when the PLA strategists believe that launch on warning posture may be beneficial for China, crisis management capability may be increasingly useful. They may just try to develop all these capabilities altogether. And again, as I said, many military and civilian experts appear to have been excluded from internal nuclear policy deliberation and making. Whereas on the military side of the equation, you have more stakeholders in the nuclear business. You have Rocket Force, you have Air Force, you have Navy that are all part of the nuclear nuclear. They are all nuclear stakeholders. They all want to strengthen their part of the nuclear cake. So there are more stakeholders, wanting to have more resources, and there's very little domestic checks and balances. There's very little scrutiny from the media, from research community, from the general public. The general public are not even aware of what China is doing regarding its nuclear capability because of lack of information and transparency. So in this process, in this domestic process, when you have increasingly strong promoters of nuclear capabilities, but very little checks and balances, I think nuclear expansion is very likely to happen. That said, it appears that at the top level, the senior Chinese leaders are still committed to asymmetric deterrent. Right? There is no clear desire for achieving nuclear parity with the United States or Russia. Mr. Xi himself seemed to have said in 2012, when talking about China's missile forces, he said, we must increasingly enhance our asymmetric strategic balancing capability against a powerful enemy, meaning the United States. And the deputy of the deputy chair of the Central Military Commission, Xu Qiliang, said recently, and I think Mr. Xi also said this 10 years ago, that we will insist on asymmetric balancing and selective development of strategic capabilities. 有所为有所不为. I think that means at least at the top level, they still don't see a value to achieve nuclear parity. They are likely to be taking an incremental step-by-step type of decision making. They expand and they re-evaluate the security environment and then make a decision for the next step. But the thing is, yes, from the Chinese perspective, its nuclear expansion is completely self-defensive. Right? Its goal is to contain the perceived American political and strategic hostility against China. But because of their expectation that after China acquires a larger nuclear capability, that would somehow contain the American political and strategic hostility. But I'm afraid that the result will be the opposite. Right? The U.S. and other Western countries, they will be very concerned about this seemingly unlimited and non-transparent Chinese nuclear buildup. And that could further worsen the bilateral security relationship and even the overall strategic relationship. So by the time China, for example, in 2030, acquires an arsenal of 1,000 nuclear warheads, I don't think U.S.-China relationship would improve. Perhaps it would become worse. There will be greater concern about China's nuclear development. But faced with this new reality of a worsened relationship or a worsened security environment, I don't think the Chinese leadership is going to say, okay, we made a mistake. We shouldn't have built up our nuclear forces. I think they're going to draw the opposite conclusion. They're going to say, well, we haven't built up enough. Right? With more nuclear weapons, maybe the Western country would eventually acknowledge our power and recognize and accept the new reality. So even though the initial intent is self-defensive, I'm afraid it could very well lead to an uncontrollable nuclear arms race between the two sides. And clearly, because of this power-centric mindset behind the nuclear buildup, there is little interest at the political level to engage in anything about arms control, because the overall consensus is it is time now for China to focus on building up our power. It's not the time to think about limiting our power potential. The thing is, does the United States understand and appreciate the political nature of the Chinese nuclear buildup? I'm afraid the American policy community is too preoccupied at the military level rationale. And they try to understand what's the specific military objective China tries to achieve with a larger nuclear arsenal. I'm afraid that's misplaced. And if the US doesn't fully understand the political nature of the buildup, they could very well decide to further enhance American strategic capability to counter this Chinese buildup. And that would further exacerbate Chinese paranoia and reinforce the Chinese belief that greater nuclear capability is necessary. So I think a better understanding of the political thinking is useful. So lastly, let me quickly offer a few thoughts to manage this situation. Again, given the political nature, I tend to believe it will be necessary for the U.S. to be more open to start a broad political dialogue with China. The increasingly clear signal from Chinese officials is that we don't want to talk about nuclear weapons. We don't want to talk about strategic stability issues with you, which is very different from before. Right? Previously, China was very interested in discussing strategic stability with the United States. China was seeking reassurance from the United States on nuclear issues. But today, I think China has moved on. China has decided to rely on its unilateral capacity to maintain a credible deterrent on the nuclear issue, and is no longer seeking reassurance from the United States. And the increasing signal from the Chinese senior leadership is that we don't want to talk about these issues unless the U.S. is willing to first address China's most important political concerns, like not to challenge CCP's role in China, not to challenge China's domestic political system, not to challenge China on Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan issues, etc. And I think that's the most that's the biggest obstacle today. I don't think the U.S. needs to. I don't think the U.S. necessarily needs to make any concessions on those political issues. But I think there's a need for the U.S. to show a willingness to have a broad political discussion on those pressing political issues, because eventually, nuclear buildup is a result, is a symptom of the growing political disagreement and political disputes between the two sides. And if we really want to tackle the nuclear escalation, we have to tackle their growing political disagreement. And there are many things on those controversial political issues that U.S. can talk with China without making immediate concessions. Right? There are many things, there are many misunderstandings about American policy, American thinking. So if U.S. starts a broad political dialogue, it might actually help better clarify American thinking and stabilize the relationship at the political level, which will pave the ground for more effective nuclear and strategic stability discussions. And then at the military and the nuclear level, I think perhaps the U.S. could be more open to engage with China on topics that are favored by China. Right? China really has insisted that if you want to talk about nuclear weapons, let's talk about no first use. Right? That's the most useful way to contain a nuclear arms race. That's the most useful way to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in national security strategy. That's the most useful way to reduce nuclear risk. The U.S. has been reluctant to talk, but I think it shouldn't. Because apparently when Mr. Biden was campaigning for president, there appears some possibility that the Biden administration might be willing to consider no first use or sole purpose policy. And if you read the Chinese reaction at that time, it is clear that China would not trust American no first use policy, even if the U.S. adopts a no first use policy officially. Same American suspicion about the credibility of no first use. So the U.S. can very well start a discussion about how do we measure, how do we understand the credibility of no first use? What are the specific criteria we can use to understand each other's credibility? What specific capabilities might not be consistent with no first use? What nuclear posture might not be? Let's have a discussion about that, and try to build some common standings which is very necessary if the two sides really wants to use a mutual no-first agreement to reassure each other. So there are many things the U.S. can talk about China, even on the issue of no-first use, that can benefit American interests. And after Ukraine war, of course, the no-first use becomes even more controversial because what Russia demonstrated during the Ukraine war is that it didn't need to explicitly threaten nuclear use against a specific country in order to acquire coercive benefit. Right? It can issue veiled or implicit nuclear threat and still achieve some benefit. And I think that makes the definition of the threat of nuclear use even less clear. And all these issues need to be discussed between US and China if they want to provide credible no-first use reassurance to each other, because the Chinese no-first use policy doesn't include a promise not to threaten nuclear use, nuclear first use in conventional war. It only promises no nuclear use. It doesn't promise no threat of nuclear use. So there are many specific issues they can discuss. And of course, there are many misunderstandings about each other's policy. As I mentioned before, perhaps the two sides' experts can sit down together and jointly look at the technical possibility for the United States to design and build a homeland missile defense system that can only deal with North Korea's ICBM without undermining Chinese ICBM. Right? Is that technically feasible? Right? They need to answer that question first before they can address their political and policy disagreements. They also had this major dispute about Stanton in 2016. Even today, the experts from the two sides never sat down together to try to understand what's the technical disagreement that underline their political disagreement over this issue. And what's specific technical issue that the two sides disagree about the radar system of the THAAD that lead them to draw very different conclusions about the capability and the implications of this single radar system. And that type of technical discussion can happen at unclassified level by relying on publicly available information because a number of independent research has demonstrated the possibility. They can jointly examine specific confidence building measures, arms control proposals. Many think tanks, experts have come up with specific arms control and confidence building measures. The thing is, those measures have not been seriously discussed together by the two sides, and China has not really come to the recognition that those measures can indeed help protect China's security interests. And I think some joint examination of those specific proposals could help increase Chinese appreciation of the value of those proposals and therefore make them more likely to be picked up by the government. Risk reduction measures is very much stressed by the U.S. government, including the recent nuclear posture review. It is viewed as the most realistic area of near-term cooperation. But the two sides disagree about who causes nuclear risks. So I think it would be useful to discuss firstly their respective views about the sources of military and nuclear risks. That's a topic that Chinese officials have indicated interest in discussing. And the US and China can use that discussion to build better mutual understanding about each other's nuclear policy and thinking. So perhaps these measures would help provide some limited capacity on both sides to better manage their nuclear relationship and slow down their current trajectory towards more dangerous nuclear escalation. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The floor is open. All right, I see Barry up first. Everyone else, keep your hand, but Barry, you get the first question. Right
So I'm trying to come back to what I thought I heard you say about the concerns that President Xi has that the Americans see the dynamism of China's growth as a power and may be tempted to try and do something about it. I thought I heard you say that that was the fundamental fear. Right? That they're afraid that the Americans will try and do something about China's rise, and that therefore some immediate action is necessary. Right? So I'm trying to figure out what they imagine the Americans might do. I mean, they actually have a theory that the U.S. is looking for opportunities for preventive war, and that somehow they need a really good lever that they can get really quickly to neutralize that perception, to neutralize that thinking. So that somehow there's some magical quality that 300 or 400 silos have that will quickly neutralize the U.S. preventive war incentive. Right? Now, I might be able to draw myself a nuclear strategy story of how this works, and I don't think that was your instinct. I think your instinct was to say that there's some political story here. And certainly in the backdrop of China's thinking about nuclear weapons, that's there. But it's not obvious how that answers the mail for a fear of American preventive war incentives. So tell me if I have it right, that you think, that they think, that the Americans are contemplating preventive war? And if so, how does this nuclear modernization so quickly answer the mail that it neutralizes the American incentive for preventive war rather than making it more intense?
Well, I'm not saying that China is deeply worried about American preventive war. I think from the Chinese perspective, the U.S. is already using all means possible to create troubles for China, to slow down China's growth. China, from the Chinese interpretation, the American criticism on China about Uyghurs, about Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, about China's domestic political suppression, is all about this overall effort to create trouble for China, to make China look bad, to make China less capable to win international support, to undermine China's international image, and as a result, somehow China needs to convince the United States that this is all futile, right? And to demonstrate stronger, comprehensive national power is the answer to change the American strategic perspective, to make the U.S. accept reality, right? And nuclear is only a small part of this solution. I'm not saying China seeks to use nuclear expansion to resolve this bigger mission of changing Western perception, but nuclear is an important part because part of demonstrating greater comprehensive national power is, of course, about economic development, about technological development, but also about military development. I think that's from day one a very important incentive for Mr. Xi to talk about the dream of a strong army, to comprehensively invest in military modernization, and within the military, nuclear is the most important part is, its strategic capability. It is viewed as having the most direct psychological impact on Chinese adversaries. So I think nuclear is part of this overall effort to demonstrate greater strategic power, and therefore to convince the US-led Western countries, don't try to resort to extreme measures to contain China. You just accept China's, just accept peaceful coexist with China. Don't try to slow down China's rise. Don't try to destabilize China. Don't try to overthrow China's political system. This is already reality. We are already there. We have the capability that would make you accept the new reality. And nuclear, I think, is part of this thinking. And in terms of military, I do think there is the Chinese concern that as China further narrows the power gap, the US will become more desperate and will use more extreme measures to contain China. And there's a growing risk the US might deliberately provoke some limited military conflict to destabilize the situation if necessary. And that's why I think one of the examples is in the run-up to the American presidential election during the end of the Trump administration, the US, the Chinese military, and also the Chinese political leadership appear to genuinely believe that the US military might deliberately provoke some conflict, perhaps in the South China Sea or another place near China. And to the extent that the US is really worried about this Chinese misperception that American senior military leaders called their Chinese counterparts two times, if I remember correctly, to clarify the U.S. intent. There's no interest in deliberately provoking tensions. Don't overreact. So I don't think China thinks the U.S. is going to launch a preemptive war to disarm China, but I think there is growing worry and genuine worry that there will be increasing U.S. attempts to exploit the risk of military tensions in order to create trouble for China, to destabilize the situation, especially near Chinese, at the Chinese doorstep, basically make it harder for China to concentrate on domestic development, so that it will take longer time for China to catch up.
Zachary Burdett.
Thanks. So my question is in some ways kind of a more nuclear version of Barry's question, and kind of what the nuclear capability and modernization of doctrine may be a remedy to. And so in particular, you mentioned there's concern that as the conventional balance increasingly favors China, that they're worried the United States may use a theater nuclear weapon, presumably either for kind of a coercive escalate to de-escalate style strategy or as part of tactical nuclear use. This first came on the radar in the 2021 U.S. China military power report that said that the Chinese defense community became increasingly concerned the U.S. would use tactical nuclear weapons against an amphibious fleet, which is presumably about 6 months after the Bridge Colby, a former DASD working on nuclear issues, proposed that in foreign affairs. So I'm curious to learn more about what you've seen as concerns about this specific scenario of U.S. kind of nuclear warfighting at the tactical level, and how these things like silos speak to that, right? Is the DF-26 is the remedy to that? It's not about the silos of how do the Chinese view this concern that's a minority view in the U.S. defense community at this point that there'll be tactical nuclear use and that's viable for us, and how do their responses kind of fit into that concern?
Yeah, I think yes, there is growing concern about U.S. Interest in threatening limited nuclear use in a conventional war. Bridge Colby's writings, I think, may have contributed to some of the Chinese concerns. And there, yes, the most direct military solution is to focus on the theater range capabilities so that China can respond in kind in a limited manner to a limited nuclear threat. So I think the DF-26, DF-21, the nuclear versions, they play an important role in this regard. The missile silos, I don't think they directly help in this regard, unless, I think there is this very generic belief that, well, as China possesses a much stronger strategic nuclear capability, right, intercontinental range nuclear capability, that would make the US more worried about further escalation of a nuclear war. And that worry in itself could deter the United States from initiating a limited nuclear threat to begin with. So somehow there is an indirect connection between those strategic nuclear capabilities and regional escalation management. But I think most important role for those strategic capabilities is to demonstrate strategic power in the hope that they can contribute to the goal of changing American assessment of balance of power. And so it's not only about deterring specific military escalation threats, but also very important about deterring or discouraging the perceived political and strategic aggression and hostility from the United States.
Thank you. So China is doing a lot of things in order to solve some problems, right? So at one level, the problem is of survivability. So I was wondering, why does not China think so much about its submarine force to solve this problem? What can you tell us about how China thinks about, is it trying to build a robust submarine force and is not able to, or does it not want to build one because of some other problems like command and control? So how does it think about this?
I don't think China is making trade-offs, right? It is basically comprehensively expanding its nuclear capabilities. As I said, in 2018, she made a very specific instruction to the Chinese naval officials that China needs to massively develop its sea-based nuclear deterrent capability, right? Yes, the Chinese SSBN technology is reportedly not as good as it perhaps wishes, but that doesn't prevent China from, procuring a large number of those less advanced submarines, right? China is already working on its third generation SSBN, the 096 class. If China is not in a hurry, it doesn't need to build a sizable fleet of its second generation, the 094 class SSBN. But in fact, China is building a rather large fleet of the second generation SSBN. So that indicates that China is not only pursuing more technologically advanced nuclear capabilities, but is increasingly interested in the size, in the quantity of its nuclear capability. I think that's something different compared with Chinese traditional thinking.
I can interject myself here very quickly. On the submarines in particular, right? The O94 class, based on the 2009 ONI report, is like very noisy. Maybe it's gotten a little quieter, but it doesn't seem like it's a great deterrent platform, no matter how many you build. And they haven't really built that many. So at least my reading of one of the factors contributing to the kind of silo breakout was sort of actually not just the desire for speed, but also a recognition that if China wanted a more robust force and deterrent, for whatever reason, including all the ones that you've mentioned, that it wasn't going to be able to rely on SSBNs to do that, right? It really had to go the silo route because of the lead time required to develop a much quieter, more effective sort of 096 class. And who knows how quiet that will be, right? I mean, naval reactors have been a huge problem for the Chinese Navy, despite what Xi Jinping might want them to do. So I sort of had, at least my pet theory was, the air leg of the triad's not great for China. They don't have a great bomber yet. Can't reach the United States. Submarines, U.S. ASW capability is very strong, not a great platform. So really what's left is expanding the ground forces, whether it's the road mobile forces and or in combination with the silo-based forces. So there is still like an imbalance, right, in what has been emphasized. And that does seem to do with at least concerns either about the ability to develop robust other legs of the triad or simply the fact that the submarines, who knows if they'll ever really get kind of a real capability there that they can rely upon to the degree they can rely upon the road mobile forces or the silo-based forces.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think China perceives values in different types of nuclear capabilities. In the long run, they want to be able to have an advanced SSBN capacity. It will take time. So, China is, so again, it reflects this sense of urgency. So we'll, expand land-based nuclear forces, we'll introduce this air-based nuclear forces, which is not necessarily that survivable. And I think there is, a trend that Chinese nuclear thinking is, becoming closer to the American nuclear thinking. They tend to see unique advantages of different nuclear weapon platforms, and they want to pursue all of them. So, yeah.
Sam, later.
Thanks so much for this talk. I thought it was really interesting, and there are a few questions I could ask. But I wanted to focus on this question of what sort of the purpose of a larger nuclear force would be, when it might come into play, and the potential reasons why they might be concerned that the United States would launch a nuclear attack. And specifically, whether or not this is an indication about Chinese intentions around Taiwan, which some people have taken this as. So, one of the most likely scenarios in which the United States might threaten nuclear coercion, where it might destabilize China's rise, is over a Taiwan invasion scenario. The Colby example, Ray is talking about sinking an amphibious invasion fleet. Do you see this as evidence in one way or another about China's intentions with respect to Taiwan, about it sort of is it a necessary prerequisite to any military invasion, or do you view it as totally sort of separate from that or tangential in some way or another?
I think on the military level, there is certainly perceived benefit of a greater nuclear capability in a Taiwan Strait contingency. Again, perceived, at the nuclear level, the perceived threat is, we need to better address this growing limited American nuclear coercion, right? We have to have the means to retaliate in kind in order to deter a limited American nuclear threat. China wants to contain a Taiwan Strait war below the nuclear level, but it believes it needs a more flexible nuclear capacity in order to achieve that goal. And with more accurate theater range nuclear forces, I think that directly addresses that potential vulnerability. But again, this does not explain. I don't think this is the primary driver of China's overall nuclear buildup, because you cannot explain what's the direct role of 300 ICBM silos in this Taiwan scenario. So I think, again, it's one of the military level rationales, but it's only part of the picture. I hope I addressed your question.
Yes,
Sam, do you follow up?
No, I don't think so. I think that addressed the question. I'll let other people get their questions in.
Okay. Right, Smith?
So in your talk, you mentioned that there isn't incentives to question this policy change because there's the significant amount of resources that have been made available to the implementing entities. I'm curious, though, is there any evidence of competition amongst the different military entities for those resources. I was thinking about the submarines and whether there's a demand by the Navy for more support for that project, or is it such that the ground forces are the predominant actor and kind of can run the show?
I tend to think the silos would be run by the rocket force rather than the army. But I would be very surprised if there is no competition. But given the level of secrecy, it's really hard to develop real insight. So I don't know.
There was a lot of green on the Central Military Commission, too,
Yes.
right? Like if one is looking at service backgrounds. Lind.
Thank you very much for your presentation. So this is maybe a little bit far-fetched, but I understand from your presentation that both in political terms as well as in military terms, this all seems to be very US driven. And I was just wondering, in Chinese nuclear thinking and so on and so forth, whether there's any concern about like other actors. I'm thinking about Russia, but also perhaps India, or whether, I understand that the United States would be like the primary relationship that they're thinking about, but whether there's like any other actors that China might be concerned about in this realm, and how we can see that perhaps translated in some of the things that it's doing.
Well, I tend to think, especially in recent years, the primary focus is on the United States. But it's also true that from the very beginning, China wants to be able to deter all sorts of nuclear threats from all possible directions. Right? There was, for some period of time, maybe even today, still concern about North Korean nuclear capability that, one day perhaps could, pose a threat to China too. I think, at the strategic level, I think China's theater range nuclear capabilities, especially the newest ones, play a secondary role of enhancing China's deterrence against India, so that it could dissuade India from so-called opening a second front on the west of China in a future U.S. China crisis to the east. So I think in that regard, there may be some connection between the theater range nuclear forces and the overall evolving geopolitical landscape to the west of China. But in general, I don't see China being particularly more worried today about India. There is still very strong confidence in China about its overall capacity to deter India. There is no growing concern about India's growing nuclear capability. There is the overall thinking remains that nuclear is not that relevant in China-India security relationship. Neither country is that interested in playing up nuclear forces against each other. They both have no first use policy. They both have an interest in containing a conventional escalation. So I think U.S. is clearly the very obvious primary focus of China's nuclear development. And of course, as I said, the same capabilities, especially the shorter range capabilities, can deter Russia too if there's a need. But of course, that need is becoming less and less obvious. There is growing nuclear coordination and even cooperation with Russia. So.
Yeah, I held off getting on the list because I didn't want to take you too far afield from the dyad you were focused on, U.S. and China. But now that the cat's out of the bag, I wanted to ask about two other countries where the conversation about nuclear breakout has become more pronounced in the public domain, and that's the ROK, South Korea, and Japan. And I wonder if you could tell us a bit about what China's concerns, to the extent to which China is exhibiting concerns about the prospects for that, given that both are treaty allies of the United States, and it does connect to the United States in that way.
I'm not sure I have unique insight on that issue, but it appears that there is growing Chinese concern about proliferation in Japan and South Korea, especially the Yoon administration. Is increasingly having serious internal debates and discussions about the nuclear option. Not necessarily indigenous nuclear, but senior officials are more willing to explicitly debate that option. That sends a worrisome signal to China. And similarly, China thinks the U.S. has been implementing selective non-proliferation policies in order to advance American geopolitical interests. Right? U.S. deliberately, from the Chinese perspective, the U.S. deliberately relaxes non-proliferation restrictions on its allies so that they can develop better capabilities which can potentially be used to deter China. So given the Chinese belief that U.S. is reducing its non-proliferation principles, at least in its implementation of those policies, perhaps China should also prioritize geopolitical consideration than non-proliferation principles in its relationship with other countries.
Just for clarification on that, thank you for that. Just want to make sure I understand what that selective non-proliferation policy applies to it. I presume it's India. Or are you talking about what the United States is allowing Japan to do?
Also relaxing the missile constraints on South Korea, etc.
Relaxing the missile constraints.
Right, and AUKUS is
AUKUS.
a concern about Australia too. And some Chinese experts are genuinely believe that AUKUS is basically a disguised effort to help Australia develop nuclear hedging options.
I see. Thank you.
We're at the end of our hour. Apologies to those who I didn't get to, but please join me in thanking Tong Zhao for a terrific presentation.
Thank you so much.